Okay, so this is, I guess, the first official video of a series of videos on the topic of love, and what I'm going to be talking about is, I have like a set of things, like a set of titles kind of that I came up with, like at least subjects to talk about. As I keep going, I'm sure there's going to be more as I make more. Like as I film, I'm sure other topics will come up, and then I'll just address them as they come. But today I wanted to talk about what kind of like there's a saying, it's like there's people who see things through rose-colored glasses, if that makes any sense, which means that they don't necessarily see they don't see things clearly, they just see them in like a really overly optimistic way, and so which leads to them being, I guess you could say it's like slightly naive, but I feel like that might be the wrong word. It's just the people who who focus like it's mainly on the good and not the bad, which isn't a bad thing. That's a good characteristic to have, but in some situations it could lead an individual to possibly getting hurt, if that makes any sense. And so kind of like the topic that I came up with is what I'm going to call a rose-colored fog. And when, let's say, two people meet and they like each other and like assume that they fall in love, they both kind of go through, I guess, like what most people would call like a honeymoon stage, if that makes any sense. Like that initial like first wave where it's just like everything is just amazing. And that is, I mean, like that's something that everyone goes through, like on any level, regardless of how old you are, like, and where you're from doesn't matter. Like everyone goes through that. It's just normal. But like you enter like a fog, if that makes any sense. It's basically like a rose-colored fog. Like you go from thinking like from going, you're not in love, and you're thinking as clearly and as linearly as you could, and just complete logic. And then you meet another person, and all of a sudden things start to get a little foggy, if that makes any sense. Like you don't necessarily see the person that you're falling for as clearly as you should. And so you and that other individual, once like you start falling for each other, you kind of enter this haze, like this fog, and you don't once you're in the fog, you don't really see the other person for who they are, I guess, or you see them the way you want to see them. Like you ignore the negative aspects of them, and then you only concentrate on the positive aspects of them, the positive aspects that make you happy. And that's cool, but it leads to some serious letdowns later on, like down the line, like assuming the relationship progresses to a point where it's over like the year mark, the 2-year mark. And it also depends on like how long that honeymoon stage, like that whole little fog stage lasts. And that's, I think, I don't exactly know how I don't know how, or I don't know what dictates how long that specific period lasts. I mean, like everyone throws out like, oh, if you're with someone, it's like the first couple months, like first 6 months, the first year, the first 2 years, and it's like how that does makes like no sense. How like there could just be like one just static number for everyone across the board. Like, oh yeah, like couples A through Z, like you all have 2 years to be happy. It's like, no. So everyone has their own like set date, and after that point, that's when you start kind of like rising from the fog, and you start seeing aspects of the other person that aren't exactly appealing anymore. And it's kind of like I think like a sobering of sorts, if that makes any sense. Like you're slightly intoxicated by the other person and their traits and the way they come off, and all you see is them. You see kind of like the superficial in a way, even if it's emotional, or it's not like, when I say superficial, I don't necessarily mean physical traits. I also mean emotional traits, like not just like facial qualities or like physical qualities. It's just like there's another type of superficial, like an emotional layer of superficialness, and those are the only qualities that, like, for example, let's say the person's a really good listener, right? And so you like the other individual because of the fact that they're a really good listener, which means in some ways you like to speak, and it doesn't necessarily give them a chance to speak, because although I'm sure they have their own opinions and they would be willing to speak if they were given the option. But you like if you like the other person, if you like an individual for like certain things, but just those things, that's a level, that's, even if it's like not physical, it's still a type of superficialness. But back to what I was saying. There, like, once you're in that fog, that haze, that like just like you can't see anything. You don't exactly know what you're doing, really. I mean, you know what you're doing, but you don't necessarily register things that could possibly be dangerous to oneself, if that makes sense. And if anything, like, the last thing you want is to be in a relationship with someone and then end up self-destructing, because that's not a good thing. And so you always, if anything, like, when you're in a relationship, I guess you could say that when you're in a relationship, it's like, obviously it's about the connection between two people, but then it's also like being able to preserve yourself as a relationship goes on. Because if you focus solely on the connection between two people and then you let yourself somewhat deteriorate, either emotionally or physically, as the relationship progresses, then you hit a point where it's almost like you lose yourself, and that's what causes relationships to break down. Like, you have to cover so many more bases when you're in a relationship than when you're single, and that's a given. But it's almost like, as time goes on, when you're with someone, the bases that you have to cover kind of expand exponentially. Like, there's always something else you have to worry about in order to make things work. And that sounds really, like, overly complicated, but it can also be really, really simple. It's just like small things, if that makes any sense. But anyways, the reason why the fog is bad is because people, or myself, I put myself in a situation where your defenses are down, so to speak. Not that's a bad thing. That's a good thing, because that's what allows people to get close to you. That's what allows people to know you better as a person. But also, it gives other people the opportunity to hurt you. Although, like, if you trust them, then obviously they won't do that. But at some point, if you get in a fight or something like that, like, things go crazy. But anyways, so you don't see the fog doesn't allow you to see other people clearly, which means that you kind of set yourself up for failure in some senses, because you don't see the bad. So why is that important? It's important because if you don't see the bad, then you only register the good, then you start to think, okay, let's assume that you and me were in a relationship and we got together and we're in the fog, so to speak. What would happen would be, it's like you would see me for only my positive traits, and I would see you for only your positive traits. And so you start to put the other person up on this pedestal, kind of. And what happens is, you have, I guess, these expectations, so to speak, of the other person, whether they're, like, said aloud or whether they're not. It's still the same thing. It's still, like, these expectations of the other person. And what happens is, it gives the other person very little breathing room. Does that make sense? Like, it gives them very little room for error, if that makes sense. So even, like, the smallest thing will all of a sudden, like, make that pillar that you put them on, or put myself on, or whatever, it makes it very unstable, and it leads to lots of heartbreak. Because you're with someone and you see this person as perfect. You're like, oh my god, I've never met anyone like you. Like, you're the most perfect human being I've ever met in my entire life. Like, there's nothing wrong about you. Like, I like everything about you. I mean, I'm sure you could like everything, but like, if you see the person as flawless, that's kind of a bad thing, because they're obviously not. Like, not everyone is perfect. You can try to be perfect. Like, I know I try to be perfect. Like, you can make a conscious effort to make yourself the most perfect human being you can be, as far as, like, morals and, like, choices and whatnot. But as absolute as you could attempt to be, there's always going to be some situations where you will fall short, even if it's something small, something insignificant. and it's always, it's a good thing to be imperfect, if that makes any sense. Like, it's not necessarily a bad thing, and if anything, as far as love goes, you should love a person for their imperfections. Even, like, you should probably love a person for their imperfections more than their perfections, if that makes any sense. Like, I don't know. I'm sure, like, you understand, but it's just, like, trying to explain it and put it into words is, like, the most difficult thing on earth. But, it's I don't know, it's a little complicated, but at the same time it's not. It's just basically, instead of going through the motions of, like, the honeymoon stage, the rose-colored fog, rose-colored lenses, glasses, whatever you want to call it, you should probably take a more logical look at things. Although people will say that you probably shouldn't think about love logically, you should follow your heart. But I don't think you should follow any of your organs without another organ giving some type of advice, if that makes any sense. So you should always at least attempt to use your head and be as objective about something as possible. If you meet someone and you like them, and, like, you start falling in love, then you should think about them as a whole instead of just looking at them partially. You should, like, think about their positive traits and negative traits, and then move on from there, if that makes any sense. And if you don't know what their negative traits are, you ask someone else. I would ask, probably, if you're in a relationship with someone and if you love them, you should probably ask your friends what they think about them. You should probably ask your parents what they think about them. I mean, I know I've asked my friends, I've asked my parents about other people. And obviously at the time, like, during the situation when you're in love with someone, you're going to hear things you're not going to want to hear, if that makes any sense. Like, you're not going to want to accept the fact that other people see negative aspects in the person that you're in love with, if that makes any sense. I just dropped my popsicle stick. So you're not going to be happy to hear the things that your friends are going to say, or maybe you are. Maybe they're going to be like, you know what, he is a really good guy, or he is a really good girl, she's great, and in which case that's awesome. But then you just have to be kind of ready for both, and you have to be mature enough to handle both, and you have to be kind of grown up enough to know what to do with the information that you're given. Just because someone's not perfect doesn't mean you instantly go and break up with them. It just means you have to be more careful. Maybe they can change, maybe they can't change. It's just one of those things. Or, on the other hand, if maybe it's not a thing about changing, maybe it's a thing about moving on to the next person. You found someone who's pretty good, but they have some traits that are kind of, I guess, let's say dangerous for you and your health, then you just would have to kind of move on and find someone else that's a little safer for you, emotionally or physically, either way. But yeah, that's kind of what I had to say as far as, like, the initial stages. And yeah, that's about it. Until next time, I guess.